Thank you, Jen and Haley, for this wonderful opportunity. Um, who would have thunk, right? That we would be doing our walking tour virtually. We certainly, when we met back in January, never imagined that this would be the outcome, but how fun, because we didn't have to worry about when it was raining this morning, whether we'd be walking or not. We don't have to worry about the humidity. So thank you so much for the involvement in this project, Heartside Neighborhood Association, Dwelling Place, and a huge shout out to Downtown Grand Rapids, Inc. for facilitating these incredible get to know you in Grand Rapids, these series. So today, the Grand River Ramble, and it's the foundation of the next 5 after this tours. It is a focus on the origins of the area. We are at the westernmost border of the neighborhood, and as the series continues, we'll be moving east, okay? So put on your thinking caps now, and we're beginning on the beautiful green space in front of the Studio Park Cinema, and it's on their Plaza, the 10th screen as they call it, and we're gonna start walking, and we turn left or west on Oak Street. And I want you to notice something. As we walk, and there's a reason I'm pointing this out, you're going to see, and on your screen right now, you'll see a sewer cover. It has some green paint on it right now because it was probably in a construction zone. But these sewer covers, I don't know, who has noticed our sewer covers in Grand Rapids? Not all cities have these, but that's our city logo. And this logo of our city was created for Grand Rapids in the 1970s by our local artist, prolific artist, Joseph Kinnebrew. He also designed the fish ladder upstream in 1974, as well as many public sculptures throughout the city. Now, note the elements of the logo. Now you can see the logo on the street sign where it says Oaks and Ionia, where we are. You can see the elements of that logo. You probably, it's become so ingrained in your brain that you don't even pick the elements apart. But La Grande Vitesse is a major component of it. And of course, La Grande Vitesse, named for the great swiftness, which is the river, which is our focus today. So people commonly refer to it as the Calder. Now, the other element I want to point out is the big yellow ball of sunshine. And according to Joseph Kinnebrew, that symbolizes Grand Rapids' bright, can-do attitude. And of course, the third element of the logo is the Grand River itself. And now, if not for this magnificent waterway, we would probably not be here today. It is the original lifeblood of civilization here. So this logo itself, for about 50 years now, the Joseph Kinnebrew logo has been displayed on everything related to the city. Street signs, sanitation trucks, flags, letterhead. I want you to think about if I missed anything. You can put that in the chat. Where else do you see the city logo? Now we're going to continue our walk, and we are turning right on Granville. If you're picturing this in your mind, or if you're visually looking at the map. And then we zigzag a little bit north on Market, then turn left or west on Fulton. But if you see this corner of Market and Fulton, you are actually at the northwest corner of the boundary of the Heartside neighborhood, okay? So that gas station you see there, if you look, that's on the left side of your screen. On the right side of the screen is a red brick building. That is part of the, that's like Consumers Power building right there. That's what that corner would have looked like at one point in time. So now we're going to walk toward the Fulton Street Bridge, and I want you to, we're just going to gaze upon the Grand River here, our Grand River. Our city of Grand Rapids was quite literally born alongside a 1-mile stretch of spectacular rapids. Now, the Native Americans called our Grand River the BAW-WA-TING. Why don't you put in chat if you knew that that was called a BAW-WA-TING? It'd be curious to see how many people knew that. So that is the Native American, the Ottawa word for far away waters. And that's titled because of the impressive length of the river. Did you know that the river, the Grand River, is the longest river in the state of Michigan? So Europeans who later explored this area, they named the waterway the Grand River. It is 270 miles, approximately, from the south of Jackson to Grand Haven. Now, here in Grand Rapids, the river flows south through a swath cut by the retreating glaciers from the last ice age, which was a little more than 10,000 years ago. So that's something to think about. People think of the Grand River because it moves, you know, from Jackson. Wait, how do I do this? I don't know how to do that backwards here, but it moves from Jackson in a north and mostly westerly direction toward Grand Haven. But in Grand Rapids, it runs due north-south through our downtown. So here is a quote I love. It says, "Before the river was changed by the work of the white man, the rapids had a nearly uniform descent for about 1 mile, sufficient to give a decided, turbulent, and wild appearance to the waters, and to make a noise that broke the stillness of the forest and echoed from the neighboring hills." And that was a quote from Charles Whitmore of the Kent Scientific Institute in 1895. Now we're continuing to cross the bridge as we talk about the river. And you see, the river was a natural division between the east and the west sides of the city. Now, the very first vehicular bridge was actually built in 1845, but that was the Bridge Street Bridge, just north of here. The original Fulton Street Bridge was built in 1885 as a wrought iron bridge. Now, today's version that we cross back and forth without giving any thought, well, that was constructed in 1928. So it is the second longest concrete arch bridge. I bet you never even thought about that before, a concrete arch bridge in Michigan. And the longest concrete arch bridge in Michigan is the Belle Isle Bridge. That's number 1. So Fulton Street is the second longest. And our own Pearl Street Bridge is the third longest concrete arch street bridge. So back to this focus on origins. Our earliest known inhabitants on the river was the Hopewell culture. And that's about 2,000 years ago. Now, they're renowned for their numerous burial mounds, the whole entire Hopewell culture in the Midwest part of our nation. But there were burial mounds here. Now, their mounds remained untouched long after their culture disappeared. Now, the Ottawa Indians who settled along the banks of the Grand River in the late 1700s, they respectfully kept those burial mounds intact. It was the white settlers in the early 1800s who destroyed and leveled the mounds on the riverbanks right here in downtown. But fortunately, there are 11 mounds still preserved, totally intact, located along of course, appropriately named Indian Mounds Trail and Butterworth. And that property is managed by the Grand Rapids Public Museum. Now, we're continuing our walk across the bridge, and there's a little pocket park. And I ask all of you, have you ever been to this little pocket park? It's BAW-WA-TING. Now, in the Native American, the Ottawa language, BAW-WA-TING is the rapids. And the rapids, it was our source of life, our earliest inhabitants' source of life. Everything man needed was provided by the river. Water, fish, animals that came to drink from the river. They used the animals for food and clothing. And it was also a beautiful resting place. The river also served as a bona fide highway for the 19 villages that were on the banks of the Grand River. Now, that would be between Lansing and Grand Haven. Now, we had an early settler, and his name was Joel Guild. But he wrote in a history book, he was quoted as saying, "Our river is 85 rods wide." Okay, 85 rods wide. Who measures in rods anymore? I had to look that up. That's 1,400 feet. Now, that 1,400 feet, it was eventually filled and narrowed at Pearl Street to 500 feet. That's a big change. Now, originally, there were 4 islands. Who knew? Who knew? There were 4 islands in the Grand River. And they were creatively called Island Number 1. And that was at the east end of Pearl Street Bridge today. Island Number 2, about where the JW Marriott stands today. Island Number 3 was at approximately Market Street. And Island Number 4, which we'll be looking upon soon, was basically beneath the Wealthy Street Railroad Bridge. Now, all but one of these was destroyed by the 1890s. And when I say destroyed, I mean filled in, changed in the name of progress and eventually industrialization. So until that time, industrialization took hold of the river. The island was a steamboat stop. One was the county prison. Another was a wholesale market. Now, as we turn off the bridge and we leave BAW-WA-TING Park, we're gonna cut behind that park. We're walking under the expressway through the Grand Valley State University parking lot, literally, toward the front of the Seidman Business Center, which you see on your screen now. We're gonna go to the southern edge of that building and take a sidewalk to the river, because the river runs right behind that Seidman building. It's a beautiful view. If you go out and walk this, you'll love the view. The back side of the Seidman building has a beautiful patio for students and staff to enjoy the river. And again, who knew unless you got out and start walking? So a little bit more history on the river. And we go to the year 1826 now. So 1826 was the arrival downtown Grand Rapids, right here, of the first permanent white settler. Okay, and this was at a time when this permanent white settler arrived, when the river was regarded by the Native Americans as a natural resource to be respected and worshiped. Well, as the white man arrived, that respect started to decline, because the Grand River, our greatest natural resource, was channeled, cleared of its natural boulders, filled in, redirected, and eventually polluted. this once pure, rushing waterway. Remember, we could hear the rapids for a mile around. Well, it was transformed into Grand Rapids Industrial Byway in the 19th century. Now, this change started with Detroit-born Louis Campau. And who knew Louis Campau was the founder of our city of Grand Rapids? In 1826, now he was 35 years old when he arrived here in 1826. He had basically bushwhacked his way west across what was then the Michigan Territory. We were not even a state yet in 1826. Now when he arrived here, he liked this place. He spent a winter living with the Ottawa Native Americans, which were, the village was about where the Gerald Ford Museum is today on the West Bank. He spent a winter living with the Ottawa on the West Bank, and he learned their ways and their language. He described the Native Americans as friendly and peaceable. Now he returned to Detroit. He came back in the spring of 1827 with his French-speaking wife, Sophie, and he had about $5,000 of goods to trade with the Ottawa. He developed this valuable relationship with the Ottawa leader, and this would be Chief Noonday. Now, Campau built a crude cabin, a trading post, and a blacksmith shop. It would be on the east bank of the river where today's Amway Grand Plaza Hotel now sits. It was the river that separated Chief Noonday's village and Louis Campau's little village. The Native Americans, when I say fur trading, what was the exchange? We often that just comes off our tongue, you know, fur trading, or trading. What was the exchange? Well, the Native Americans were trading fur, as in animal fur, pelts, berries, and maple sugar. And what did Louis Campau have, or his predecessors before him, the transient traders that came through prior to Louis Campau becoming a permanent trader here? Well, they had what they referred to as fancy goods, guns, ammunition, and of course, whiskey, which the Native Americans, and they nicknamed firewater. Well, Campau made Grand Rapids his permanent home and then became, of course, prominent among its pioneers. Now, as we continue walking, we're walking along the river south, and let's talk about 1837 now. It's a big year in Grand Rapids. It's a big year for the state of Michigan, because by 1837, we had collected, so to speak, enough population to become a state of Michigan. So I wonder how many of you could say, oh yeah, Michigan became a state in 1837. So I wink, that'll be on the test. You'll want that. Well, in 1837, the first steamboat was dropped into the river here in downtown Grand Rapids, and it was called the Governor Mason. Well, you know why it was called the Governor Mason? Because he was the first governor of Michigan. The regular run from Grand Rapids was to Grand Haven. Soon after, riverboat freight, as well as the passenger traffic, was big business. So there was a succession of 80 plus different boats that plied the waterway. But the arrival of the railroad in Grand Rapids in 1858, that changed river transportation. By the year 1917, riverboat traffic was dead. Now let me quick review a little bit, since we're talking about the river, some population numbers to give you a sense of how big we were. When we became a city in 1850, we had about 2,500 people who lived in the city. When we reached the turn of the century in the year 1900, we had about 90,000 people. That's exponential growth, friends, exponential growth. So I'm walking south along the river, but I divert a little bit in order to tell the story. If you can picture the intersection of Front Street and Butterworth, there is the GVSU parking lot that you can see in this photograph on your screen, and a boulder. I would say 98% of Grand Rapidians have not stopped to read that incredible plaque and its significance on Grand Rapids. Well, this was where a Catholic mission was established on the west bank of the Grand River by the legendary Father Frederick Baraga in 1833. He served locally only 2 years. His replacement was Reverend Andrew Wyszewski, a Hungarian native, and he presided over the Catholic mission and later the earliest settlers on the East Bank in presiding over the Catholic effort until his death in 1852. Now, there was this Catholic mission, and then the Baptist mission was north of that, and that had been here earlier. In fact, coincidental with the arrival of Louis Campau was the establishment of the Baptist mission. The Baptist mission is on the property of where the Gerald Ford Museum sits today. Thus, that property is called Anabawan Park in honor of our Native American history. Anabawan, translated, means resting place. Okay, now the missions were operating simultaneously as our little village, our fledgling village, is growing up along the Grand River. Well, negotiations at the national, federal level were going on, and the Native Americans ceded their property. At first, it was the cession of lands north of the Grand River to the U.S. federal government in 1836. So the Native Americans were assigned to reservations in other parts of the state and eventually of the country. Unfortunately, sadly, the last of the Ottawas were forced to move in 1855. So that is a very short period of time. 1826, Louis Campau is the only white man here. 1855, the Native American population had mostly been moved. Now, according to a website, iftheriverswells.org, here's a beautiful quote that summarizes that period in our history as it relates specifically to the river. As the lands were cleared of their original inhabitants, the settlers began the process of clearing what was once a vast and varied landscape and replanting it for farming and large-scale agricultural and extraction-based industries. Extraction-based industries would be the gypsum. The land no longer was seen as a basis for survival, but rather as a basis for profit. The indigenous view, and just a reminder, the word indigenous means first peoples. The indigenous view of the land and that of the European settlers was in direct conflict, whereas the indigenous population sought to live in harmony with nature, the European settlers viewed the land simply as raw material for economic success. Now, here's a quote from Campau himself, summarized how he viewed what he called the conquest of West Michigan. He says, "A few white men arrived and there was a little trouble. A few more white men arrived and there was more trouble. Then a lot came and the Indians became bad and the times grew worse. Finally, the Indians were relieved of their possessions." Well, it's interesting that Louis would say that is because he was a part of that process as well. He was probably, I guess, waxing bittersweet about the change. So as we keep walking, we're going to cross the railroad tracks. Well, I do this to remind us that the year 1858 was another big turning point in Grand Rapids history. In general, specifically for the Grand River. It saw the construction of many bridges and it welcomed the first train engine. Now, railroads marked the beginning of the decline of the riverboat traffic. But as the boat traffic began to decline, log running on the Grand River increased. In 1866, the logging industry dammed the Grand River near what is now 6th Street. Of course, you know this dam, to make it easier to transport logs downstream. Logs were finished into lumber, and then they were rafted to Grand Haven, transferred to schooners, then delivered to Chicago and other ports. In fact, it was the year 1873 that was considered to be the peak year for log output. You know, that's not so long ago, is it? So we keep on walking, and as we're walking along, I'm going to remind you of some of the businesses that were located later in time along this industrial byway. And the building that you actually see on your screen, the white brick building, still stands. And I'll tell you its story. If I say the word Tanglefoot, as you see on the screen, I wonder how many of you know what Tanglefoot is. It is the most incredible, I think, piece of early industry. So this building you see was the industrial campus named after a flypaper manufacturer. You say, like, what is flypaper? Well, over 1 century ago, in an era of horse-drawn carts, flies were a big problem, a very big problem. Customers for flypaper ranged from farmers to lawyers, and they would in your average household, they would visit the local drugstore and they would order flypaper and wait while their flypaper was prepared by hand. So the most commonly used adhesive for flypaper at the time either dried out too quickly, it was messy, or soaked through its paper backing, creating just an absolute mess. So we had two local pharmacists, the Thum brothers, T-H-U-M. They had an incredible idea. They said, we developed an adhesive formula in the back of our drugstore, but it's from natural. It was the first organic product already found on the shelves, castor oil, resins, and wax. And it was a hit. They were shipping flypaper around the world in 1885. That building you see still stands today. And it has, there still is a subsidiary of the original Tanglefoot flypaper company that still works out of a portion of that building, and the rest of the building has been used as an artist enclave for many years. But most recently, Art Prize Project 1, they hosted a site-specific artwork this last fall. Now, I also love in the Grand Rapids Public Museum, when you are walking through Main Street, Grand Rapids, on the first floor, and there's a general mercantile store that, or maybe it's more specifically a kind of like a hardware store, it has Tanglefoot flypaper hanging in the window. And when you go out on all these walking tours and you see, you make all these connections when you go back to the museum, and the street of Old Grand Rapids is using some of these other things that we'll learn as we go along. Okay, now another neighboring industry right there as we walk toward Wealthy Street was the neighboring Louis Padnos company. Now, Louis Padnos, he actually immigrated from Russia as a teenager. By horse and wagon, he peddled and traded throughout the U.S. and finally settled in 1905 in nearby Holland. By 1910, he had grown a small scrapyard business in Holland, dealing in rags, hides, metals, and furs. So what started as junkyards have now become recycling centers in Michigan and Indiana. Fourth generation family members manage the business today. So today, Padnos is over 600 team members strong with 26 locations. But I also wanted to point out his son is Stuart Padnos, and he was not only known for taking on the business, but also for his art, because he was very creative and he used the scrap metal from the scrap yards and created artwork, and that's all over West Michigan now. In fact, if you go to the Gerald Ford Museum and you see a scrap metal Jerry Ford bent over getting ready to hike the ball, he's a football player in this. Stuart Padnos had been a contemporary of Gerald Ford. Okay, keep walking. July 2009, we see this Exodus place here. It was founded by Robb Munger. He developed a plan to completely remodel a former corrections facility located here on the Grand River. Now, this facility had been abandoned for more than 2 years and was badly damaged. But Munger and volunteers, including formerly homeless men, they saw its potential for something great. So they transformed the building room by room into a home for men transitioning out of difficult circumstances. But unlike a homeless shelter, Exodus Place works on a membership basis. The residents pay a monthly fee, which includes more than just a place to sleep. Members receive 3 meals a day, case management, counseling and goal planning, free laundry and haircuts, a variety of educational opportunities, fellowship, and more. However, as part of their membership, residents are expected to comply to a strict set of rules. They have 0 tolerance for violence, drugs, and alcohol. There's capacity to house 140 men there. So now you know where Exodus Place is located, and we turn the corner on Wealthy Street and we start heading east. Now, have you ever wondered how Wealthy Street earned its name? And people will say, well, sure, because of the rich people, affluence. Well, that's a very logical guess, but it's not. You see, pioneer Jefferson Morrison, he sold his tract of land, which was on this south side of downtown at the time. He sold his tract of land to the city of Grand Rapids when it was physically growing. They needed more space. So with that sale, he was entitled to name 3 streets. So he chose Jefferson, which still stands today, Morrison, which no longer is in the city. Morris is, but not Morrison. And then he named a street Wealthy. And that was because his wife's first name was Wealthy. Now, Jefferson Morrison was a judge, and he named this street in her honor. So it was Wealthy Street that was the southern border of the newly incorporated city of Grand Rapids in 1850. Now, As we're standing on the middle of the Wealthy Street Bridge, we can look north to the skyline, and we can look south to what is industry. Two different kinds of view. Related to industry, let's review the furniture industry. Well, that flourished as a result of the loggers' harvest. The river was not used for recreational purposes, but continued as this industrial highway. Canals were dug out on both sides of the river to supply, of course, power to the business enterprises, water power, and then hydroelectric power. Furniture factories, sawmills, barrel companies, flour mills. It was said that many factories on the river did not have windows on the river side of the buildings because it was not a pretty sight or smell. As the city continued to grow up around the river, so did the amount of raw sewage dumped into it. During summer, the low water levels exposed its stench. 5 low-rise dams, which are still used today, they were installed to keep the water deep enough to cover the sewage. Also, because of the growth of the city and the need for building materials, the riverbed was scoured of granite boulders and the limestone. By 1911, the concrete flood walls were built to control the flow of water and to protect the city from the, as we know, unpredictability of the rising water each spring. Now we look out over the bridge into the actual water today, which is clean. The island beneath the Wealthy Train Bridge is a bit of a local legend right now. It is nicknamed Punk Island. This was something I had never heard of until I started researching this. It got this nickname because punk rockers allegedly used to squat there during the summer months. It is city land, but not an accessible park. And you can actually be arrested for trespassing here. The island floods when the river rises. The city actually refers to this as Jackson Island, and it is the last remaining island in the Grand Rapids City portion of the Grand River. Now we've finished crossing the bridge and we've turned left on Market, and we're actually standing at the physical, as you see on the red dot on your screen, physically the southwest corner of the boundary of the Heartside neighborhood. And I'll tell you why Market Street is named Market Street. Well, it was the year 1897 and a city wholesale market was established about where the city's park and recreation offices are now located, right off the expressway. And it would have been on island number 3, which ran parallel to today's Market Street. It was, before it was Market Street, it was called Waterloo Street. So this several acre city market was strictly for wholesale produce, wholesale. It was a place for grocers to come and buy wares, then in turn sell them at retail prices. So Grand Rapids grew into this hub of wholesale grocery buying and selling because of the railroad and interurban railway lines. They connected us to the shipping centers in Grand Haven and Muskegon, and the city's proximity to growing centers like the Fruit Ridge and the fertile soils of Ottawa County. But the homemakers, they did not like that they could not use the wholesale market. So they lobbied for retail markets. And so the Leonard Street Market on the west side was the first public retail market in Grand Rapids. It quickly spawned other public retail markets. There was a South Side Market, and that was established at South Division and Cottage Grove. And then there was the East Side Market, which arose in 1922, which eventually was renamed the Fulton Street Farmers Market. So the Leonard Street Market survived until the mid-1960s, and the Southside Market actually lived until the 1970s. And of course, we know the Fulton Street Markets is alive, well, and thriving and outlasted them all. And they now have recently remodeled facilities. Now, another use for this island that was the wholesale market that I referred to is it was a park. Island Park was formed on the west side of this slip of land in 1912. The park was best known as a baseball and football venue until it was closed in 1934. Now, here's a little known fact that I love. I love the little facts. So, a section of the grandstands from this island park and some of the fence, they were used in the construction of the new Valley Field, the Sullivan Field, which is on the northwest side, and that was in 1937. The area surrounding the perimeter of the island park was eventually filled in and is now the site of our City Services Center that I was referenced earlier, that we're walking by right now. But coming soon, this whole area that we're walking by right now is going to be transformed again into a riverfront development that will be a mixed use of living, retail, and park. So fasten your seatbelts, that's coming in the near future. Now, an often asked question today is, what is the future of the Grand River? Well, what you're looking at is a schematic that was provided to us by Grand Rapids Whitewater. Well, you've heard about this project. It's more than a decade in the making now, and it is the champion for pursuing the revitalization of Grand Rapids' most important natural asset, and of course, our city's namesake. So Grand Rapids Whitewater is a grassroots, not-for-profit organization dedicated to helping to achieve the dream of restoring the rapids. The solution is to bring the river back to a more natural state for fish and creatures, remove dangerous dams, and create ways for people to access and use the river. So this revitalization project is well underway. We can look forward to kayaking, fishing, rafting, stand-up paddling, wading, and other forms of water and riverfront recreation. And this is from Ann Street on the north to Fulton Street. But we must be patient. This is a $45 million jigsaw puzzle. What started as a brilliant idea of two men that wanted to restore the rapids has become a project that includes the DNR, multiple municipalities, a huge price tag, grants, permits. It was a, shall we say, pleasant Pandora's box, but we need to be patient while they put the pieces together. So now maybe we'll see the completion of this project in 2025, 2026. So in summary, citizens of Grand Rapids today are learning to appreciate our Grand River again, but in an entirely new way than our ancestors. But you know, it takes some walking along the river edges, talking about its history and its meaning, and learning about the role of this natural asset to take notice again of the river and to fall in love again with the BAW-WA-TING. Now, in 1905, there was a prediction in the editorial page of the Grand Rapids Evening Press, 1905. So let's just say roughly 100 years ago. And it said that by the year 2005, the Grand River would be more a sewer than a river. Well, thankfully, we've corrected our actions. The river flows through our lives as much today as it did when our ancestors depended upon it for industry and transportation, and before that, for nourishment it provided to the indigenous peoples, it flows through our lives today in different ways. So as a resident or a visitor to the Heartside neighborhood, it is an exciting time to witness the very, very positive changes to the western border of the neighborhood, both in the river and on land. So thank you.
All right, everybody. So let's give Caroline a quiet round of applause because we are all muted. But we are going to try something a little bit different this right now. We want to make sure to thank all of our community partners for the contributions of images used in today's presentation. But we also want to spend just a couple of minutes connecting with one another about what we learned today. So we're going to actually be moving everyone into smaller chat rooms. In your chat room, we're going to ask that you just take a couple of minutes. There will be about 5 to 6 people in your chat room, and just discuss a couple of questions that we're posing. If you haven't done this before on Zoom, you'll be moved into another room for just a short period of time, and then you'll be brought back together. We're only going to be in there for about 5 minutes. So if you would share, what topics would you like to learn more about on our future tours? And what's one fact that you learned today that was new to you? If you're a Dwelling Place staff person, if you could please write down some of the things that people share that they'd like to learn more about in future tours in your chat room, we'd really appreciate that. We're going to be in those for about 5 minutes, and then we're going to come back together with Caroline. If you do need to head back to work, there is a link for the survey in our chat. Please ensure that you fill out the survey as it is the sign-in for today's tour. So we're going to move into those rooms. You'll get a notice when it's time to return to the main room, and that will happen automatically. So we will see you all in 5 minutes.